Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to the study session for the last day of January of 2019. All of our council is present. We have several items on the agenda this morning, but the first is appointments to council committees, regional boards, and other committees. Council, have you had a chance to look at this? Any discussion, or is there a motion on this?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Luna.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Next item is appointments to the Mesa Housing Services Governing Board and the Museum and Cultural Advisory Board. Any discussion or a motion on this item?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Luna. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Next item is to hear a presentation and provide direction on staff recommendations for regulating commercially rented bicycles and scooters. We do have one person who wants to speak, and we'll hear from this person after the staff presentation. Good to have our transportation department here, gentlemen. Thank you. I know the whole country has been wrestling with this, so we're anxious to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Mayor. Members of the council, good morning. My name is R.J. Zeter. With me is Eric Guderian, our Deputy Director for Traffic Engineering. We also have assistance from the City Attorney's Office. Margaret Robinson has been working with us. Lieutenant Daravan from the Police Department has been very involved. She couldn't be here this morning, but we have sought their input along the way. We've also gotten some information from the Fire and Medical Department as well. So we'll jump right in. So the term shared active transportation vehicle is meant to, well, for my real first, sorry. We'll go over the agenda. We'll talk about the purpose of the shared active transportation vehicles, operators currently working in Mesa or interested in coming to Mesa, issues that we've identified regarding this topic. Excuse me. Some preliminary ridership information from Bird and Lime, who are operating in November. A national review, and then we'll discuss some options that council can consider so we can get some direction to keep moving forward. So the purpose of a shared active transportation vehicle is to provide a last mile alternative option for short trips, as well as connection to transit, as well as recreational uses of the scooters and the bikes that are here in Mesa. There are currently 3 operators in town today: Lime, Jump, and Bird. Lime and Bird are operating scooters. Jump has both scooters and e-bikes. It's a pedal assist electronic bike that you may have seen in Mesa. We've already had conversations additionally with Lyft and Spin. Lyft has indicated that they plan to arrive in Mesa in mid-February. Spin is the last company we've talked to most recently, but they've also expressed interest in the Mesa market. So that could have, if they all come, a total of 5 operators in the city, which will be something we'll discuss as we move along. Issues that we've identified regarding the shared transportation vehicles are Americans with Disability Act, right-of-way management. So as everyone's out and about, you can see where these things are placed. You'll hear the term staging. Staging is where the companies place the scooters and the bikes, usually early in the morning. That's kind of a common industry term. And then you've got the other end when the users are done with their ride of how these vehicles get parked, in the right-of-way. Another question that's come up is how many vehicles themselves are going to be allowed or we wish to have on our streets. Time frame for operator response. When the bikes first came into town, if you recall, we had a couple of the shared bike operators, come into the city, and they came into Mesa pretty heavy. They withdrew pretty quickly, but when they came in, we were having some real challenges with response time for bikes that were left in inappropriate places or blocking bus shelter seating, ramps, that sort of thing. One of the benefits of the electronic vehicles is that they physically have to be removed pretty much daily and then charged and put back. That has reduced some of the challenges we've had because the operators or their contractors are physically touching the devices on a daily basis. Safety is certainly an issue that has come up. We've talked about it. Staff, police department, fire department have been involved in these conversations. Speeding, inexperienced users, lack of helmets, although the operators will encourage folks to use helmets. At least one of the operators has a program where they'll mail you a helmet for free if you pay the shipping charge. But in practice, we're just not seeing folks that are using these bikes and scooters, wearing helmets. Along this line, and we'll get into this a little bit more, are the age of people using the scooters. Many of the companies have an 18-year-old age requirement that you electronically sign as part of the app, when you go to use these. But in practice, again, we can just see that there are many people, using the scooters and now with the bikes in town that appear to be below the age of 18. The last bullet is kind of a minor point, but there had been discussion by one of the operators of allowing people to basically sublet sets of scooters and have their own, I don't know if the right term is franchise. And we identify that only because if that happened, it might become a challenge from a management standpoint of how many folks we have actually operating within the right-of-way. This is again from November, ridership information from Bird and Lime. You can see a difference that I wanted to point out that, Bird was showing an average ride distance of just over 2 miles, where Lime was showing an average ride distance of 1 mile. We attribute that difference to Bird being more spread out in Mesa, where Lime was more focused on the transit corridors. So perhaps more people were using those to connect to and from transit rides. We've talked to a number of cities. Andrew Calhoun, our management assistant, has done a ton of research. So if we need to dive into any details, Andrew can come up and help us with that. But you'll see that we've talked to several cities in the Valley, as well as several large cities in different places in the country. I will note that most recently we're just becoming aware of Gilbert. Town of Gilbert is exploring this issue as well. What we're calling the National Regulation Review, and this is in response to council the last time we met on this topic to take a look at what's happening both locally and around the country. So just some high points of important points of what some of the cities are addressing. Tempe, for example, our neighbor to the west, is moving forward with a licensing process where operators in that community would have to have a license issued by the city. And then there are, of course, a number of conditions that are attached to that license. Scottsdale has chosen to not require licenses, but yet they did put some requirements into their city code regarding parking and staging and sort of the use of the vehicles. Peoria had been working on a pilot program. You might have recently read that the conversation has ceased between the single operator that was in Peoria and the city, and there's a point that we'll talk about that's important regarding to that. Phoenix is working on a proposed pilot program with geographic boundaries centered around their downtown area, and then you'll see Atlanta, Dallas, and Denver all have permit requirements tied to the operator staging in the right-of-way. Some issues as well, and again, I mentioned a little bit of this. For example, Atlanta caps the speed limit of electronic scooters at 15 miles an hour. You'll find some variance in what some of the other cities are requiring, but that's the number, at least on the scooter side, that we feel comfortable with. We're told by Jump that the e-bikes will go up to 20 miles an hour, so that's an issue to consider as well. So staff is recommending for what we call any regulated option, and then we'll get into those options, but sort of base requirements that staff would recommend that council consider are a license or permit. You can kind of look at the terms synonymously. Insurance and indemnity requirements, excuse me. This is an important issue. It's one that I think we're going to need to spend some more time with the industry discussing. Some of the cities have proposed indemnification requirements that the industry is pushing back on. And I won't pretend to be Mr. Smith or his staff, but from what we read, the issue here is negligence, and who's negligent. And so from what I read, from the operator's perspective, they will provide some sort of insurance and indemnification to the city, except that when the city's negligent. So we'll need some help in defining that term because I think it becomes important in terms of protecting the city from any liability arising out of the operation of these scooters and bikes here in town. User requirements, allowing We would allow the scooters and the bikes to be operated on pathways, sidewalks, and bike lanes. Of course, the exception is within downtown Mesa on Main Street, where these vehicles are not allowed on the sidewalk, although in practice, we know that the scooters in particular are being driven on the sidewalk. We'll discuss fees, customer service requirements, and again, staging, as well as data sharing. We would like to see monthly reports from anyone who is operating in Mesa. A number of the operators, probably all, have dashboards that they can set up for us that we would have access to. We're not looking for reporting necessarily on a daily or weekly basis. Frankly, we don't have the staff to support that, but we would like to see where the vehicles are, sort of where they're being used, so we can observe over time, where they're being most effectively, used, where the interest and demand is for those vehicles. Option one is what we've termed as a citywide approach, more of a market-based option where there would be a license required. However, there would be no limit to the number of operators or the number of vehicles that could operate in the city. As well, they could operate citywide, and there would be no restriction geographically where these vehicles could operate or be staged, which some cities have set some geographical limits. Option two is what we're calling the limited approach. This is a more regulated approach, certainly with the goal of providing first and last mile access to transit. Staff believes that this would allow for greater oversight of the vehicles that are being placed and used within our right-of-way. We would work under this scenario to prepare a request for proposals that we would evaluate operators who submit and look at their business plan, the number of vehicles, their customer response, that sort of thing, and do an evaluation and try to select operators that best meet the needs of our city. Some requirements under this option could be limiting the number of operators in the city, potentially restricting the geographical limits of where the vehicles are placed. You'll hear the term geofencing. Potentially restricting the number of vehicles in the city themselves so that we're not overwhelmed with the amount of scooters and bikes that are placed, again, within the right-of-way. The last option is a ban. We're advised by the city attorney's office that we could construct, or how we would modify our ordinance requirements, that in theory we could ban these vehicles from operating within the right-of-way. However, we have some concerns to go down this path. We're not sure what that would open up in terms of response from the industry and what that might do in terms of the legislature potentially stepping in and providing some regulation at the state level. Fees, I know this is a big question, and again, this is one that the operators have expressed a lot of interest with. Mesa, at the staff level, we had looked at a permit and licensing structure that would cover our costs to administer the program. You can see from both locally and around the country that cities have adopted different fee structures. The blue column just shows what the estimated revenue would be generated based on 3,000, 1,000, and 2,500 vehicles here in the city, as well as relocation or impoundment fees if we have to retrieve these vehicles and place them in storage and have the companies come retrieve them. If you go down to the bottom, you'll see that Tempe, our neighbor to the west, has proposed a $1.06 per vehicle per day fee. This has the industry has expressed concern at taking a fee to this level. What the industry is generally proposing is, rather than a flat fee per vehicle per month, is that they have proposed 10 cents per ride per vehicle. And so the revenue would be generated based on the number of actual trips that are taken, rather than simply having a vehicle placed within the city's right-of-way. At this point, I know I went quick. Sorry.
One question on that slide. The $100 annually, that is per SATV, or that's a fee per business? So the business would just have to pay $100 for like a business permit to operate in Mesa?
That's correct.
Which one?
Just a base fee, not per vehicle, just the
Per
application
business.
fee for the permit itself.
Awesome, thank you.
But then the $2 monthly per vehicle would apply after that. So I know I've covered a lot of information pretty quickly, but we're happy to try to answer any questions that you have. I believe members of the industry are here as well, if you have questions of them.
Thank you, RJ. Mayor, well, our intention hopefully today is just get further direction from council to move forward. Ultimately, if we can kind of get a framework or concept, then we can go back and start crafting an ordinance. If we can kind of get some direction maybe from council today, then we can come back with a draft ordinance and then work on that. And then, maybe a time or two, then we'll be able to have, kind of get to where we need to be. But we want to just kind of start narrowing the conversation down a little bit. You kind of see we've given you really intended purposely some bookends of options here and maybe get the discussion to kind of see where we're headed. And then the details as far as the permit fees and indemnification, if you want to weigh in on that, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll just include that in a draft ordinance. So thank you.
Thank you. And I do have, at this point, one request to speak. So I might suggest that I'm sure there are questions related to this presentation, and I think we should ask them now while the staff is here. And then maybe before we start pontificating, we hear from the public. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So let's, what questions do we have from these gentlemen? Mr. Thompson.
Mayor, I thank you. I like the option one because I think it should be a market-driven, market-based approach. I'm not for really over-regulating the industry. My only concerns that I've had with scooters, or with scooters and bikes really, is putting them in the right-of-way where they are blocking ADA access and so forth. What I like about Bird is that they come in and pick their scooters up at the end of the day, they charge them and then redeploy them or restage them. So they're not necessarily left in the right-of-way overnight and then they're restaged in the mornings, and so they're not blocking ADA. The last thing we want to do is get back to like we were with the yellow bikes where they were just dumped in people's front yards or end up in the canal. My other concern with the scooters is we see a lot of young kids that definitely are under the age of 18 that are riding these without helmets. And I think, meeting with industry earlier this week, they talked a lot about educating parents, because it seems like a lot of parents are just loading up carts and letting their kids go out, and have fun with the scooters and so forth. But, I think there should be some type of educational component that industry does with the parents or with individuals as they're signing up online for the application and so forth. But I don't really want to overregulate. I don't want to stymie technology, nor do I really want to stymie the business or the industry's opportunity to grow and be successful. So that option one for me would be, I'd be fine with that.
Thank you. Questions for staff? Mr. Whittaker.
I have a question on the slide, the option two, the words termed license with request for proposal. What does that mean exactly?
What it means is that we would essentially enter into we would do a request for proposal, seek the responses, or receive the responses, and once we've selected one or more vendors, there would be a term or a time limit on that agreement. So council would have to approve that agreement, and it would simply have an expiration date.
Does that mean we would select only one vendor to operate in the city, and then the other vendors would be locked out on like a contractual basis? Am I understanding you correctly?
Councilmember Whittaker, that's correct. So we haven't set on the number being one. That's not something we've settled on how many is the right number yet. But yes, the theory here is that this would be a competitive process where the city would select particular operators to be in the city, and the other businesses that not selected would not be able to stage their vehicles within our right-of-way.
Okay, thank you. Also, the statistics on these, do we have any information from medical on how many people have been injured while operating at SATV, or any statistics on that?
We have some limited information, council member. Fire and medical searched through all their records. Police department did as well. I don't want to speak, but the way fire medical explained to me is because they didn't have a specific code for scooters. They had to kind of do a text search, to see what has come out of that. I think at least they indicated they were going to work on more specifically tracking, the incidents. So there have been some serious accidents that have occurred because of these vehicles, or due to these vehicles being operated. Chief.
Good morning, thank you. Good morning, Mayor, Council. RJ's correct in saying initially we did not have a specific code, so when we queried scooters, we got a number of calls based on all kinds of scooters that are out there. Starting at the end of November, we pinged specifically the rental scooters, and since the very end of November till today, we had about 16 incidents with the rental scooters. Most of them were minor injuries, 2 that had significant or moderate to significant injuries. So 16 in about 6 weeks.
Can you elaborate on the 2? Like, did that involve like a car hitting one of these individual, or did any involve like vehicular incidents?
Yeah, you know what, I don't have the detail of it. We just know that they were more significant. Generally, it's a car with a scooter or losing control of the scooter, so I don't have the specifics on the 2.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that's since November, correct?
Yep, since the November 30th.
Okay, thank you. The other question can I keep? The other question I have is legal. Are we liable? I know you had touched on it briefly, but it didn't sound like there was a clear answer. Are we legally liable for accidents that occur related to the SATVs?
Mayor and council member. So I'll say the answer is no, obviously, in this context. Can we be sued? Yes. In fact, we're aware of other cities in California predominantly that have been sued on a number of cases. So that's why, as part of the license, we'd seek an indemnification so that we were able to tender then that lawsuit to the industry and have them defend that lawsuit. So.
But no lawsuits that you're aware of that have actually been won by the individuals against the municipalities in regards to California?
So I don't know. There's so many in a couple cities in California. I don't know if there's been any that've gone to trial and whether or not they've won. But there's quite a number in a few of the larger cities in California.
Okay. The other question I have, and I'm assuming this falls under legal as well. One of the things that we had mentioned are being able to track all of these scooters. Is there not an issue with privacy as it pertains to where individuals are traveling and the government taking that data and then knowing where everybody's located that's on one of these scooters?
So, Mayor and council member, I'd say this is that you're voluntarily decide. If you own the scooter yourself, you can go buy these at a number of stores and you can do that. And so there's no tracking on those. But if you're going to use them within the right of way and you're going to be able to stage them, we can put reasonable conditions on that or prohibit them. And so it can be simply one of the terms of the license.
Okay, so businesses aren't protected under that same form of privacy that an individual would be as far as like having to provide the locations of the scooters or where these people are traveling?
Well, I'd point out this is that you're giving up that privacy interest in order to be able to stage that scooter within the city's right of way. And so, if you want to rent or lease scooters on a business, you want to own a scooter business and rent them. We're not trying to seek that information from those people.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Jim. The only comments that I want to make in regards to this is I did a poll of 344 people, and 72% came back and said that they didn't want any form of regulation or licensing, whatsoever. I think within moderation, clearly we need to be able to manage these on city right away. But the one thing that I would say is that we don't impose fees that stifle innovation. I mean, people are clearly choosing this method of transportation, so I would just hope that we stay cautious of the fact that we're not overpricing the regulations and killing off the industry when people are using these as a form of transportation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Mr. Luna.
Thank you. When you developed option 2, did Andrew, when he did his research, did he look at another community and make recommendation based on what other communities are doing?
Sorry. There are a few cities that have gone the RFP route. Some cities are still in a pilot phase that are looking at that. So I'm not immediately aware of cities that have formally finished this process, but I know that a number are considering it.
Okay, so we don't have any information based on a pilot study of another community that's similar to City of Mesa?
Portland has just completed their pilot program where they did a evaluation of just doing it in their downtown area. And so they're going back and evaluating that. I think that's where Phoenix is headed, is containing it within their downtown area.
Right.
I think there's a group of other cities out there that we can get that have made that evaluation to try to manage it, set it up in a specific area where there was high intensity of use, but then to be able to make sure that the vendors were performing within the regulations that were being placed, and they were being responsive. And a lot of cities that's the challenge, right, is how do you manage this across an entire city as they begin to evolve out? And so that's our concern too, is on a citywide basis, not to overburden regulation, but as the scooters kind of migrate further out,
Right.
As our ability to respond and be able to manage that. So what we saw was there have been some cities said, you know, and it's obviously if it's the idea that the industry's suggesting that these are kind of micro mobility services, then they're associated with transit. The idea is to kind of group them around transit corridors and then allow them to grow from there. And actually I've seen today, you can go up and down, you see where a lot of the placement of the scooters are associated with transit, bus stops, and I think we appreciate that a lot of them are using or co-locating next to bike racks. And so I think they're kind of seeing the advantage of that too. And so that's just one option we want to provide to council. But there are some cities who have done pilot programs where they have defined a specific area where to manage that. And I would suggest we do that. That could be one option.
Yeah.
And then we could grow it, right? As the need or the demand continues to grow, we could expand it from there.
So when we're talking about the transit corridor, are we talking from, let's say, Price Road all the way to Gilbert, potentially?
I think
Is that an area we're looking at? And are we finding the scooters beyond that?
Councilmember Whittaker, yes, we are finding scooters beyond that. I mean, you'll see a significant number in the transit corridor, following light rail. But if you go to Southern Avenue, for example, in the Fiesta District, you'll also see a number of scooters in that area with MCC and some of the other things that are occurring there. But just one of the operators, Bird, in particular, being here already, you'll see their devices, further out. Many of them are parked close to transit stops,
Right.
But they have branched out further away from just sort of the downtown or the light rail corridor.
Well, to me, it makes sense, especially if you're a student taking the light rail and then going to Mesa Community College, that you'd want to take a scooter. My concern is the proliferation of all these devices, in the city of Mesa. You see them thrown virtually in many locations and not kept. So that's my concern. I think we need to look at how we limit how many are placed within the city of Mesa, and certainly consider some kind of fee structure. Personally, I mean, I wouldn't ride a scooter, but I see a lot of the young kids riding the scooters, and that's a great way for them to get from point A to point B. So I think that's probably a good thing for our city. My concern is in riding the scooters are not a right of way. I was at Mongo's the other day, I almost got run over by a scooter. So we need really to address those issues. And I'm concerned about somebody that may be disabled and a scooter crash into them, and who's liable and those kind of issues. I think that's something we need to look at as well. But I would support, I think, option 2 as something that we might want to pursue.
Councilmember Luna, as staff has started our research and also engaged, we've had a lot of conversations with the industry to get their feedback. They ask us questions, we've asked them a lot of questions. We've kind of come from the sort of the bottom up, in the sense that we're only seeking to find the sort of the balance point in terms of what the right amount of regulation is. We're not seeking to over-regulate, as Mr. Brady says, nor are we seeking to create a profit center. In terms of the fee structure, we were looking for fees that would cover our costs, so to speak, but not something that it became punitive, or as Councilmember Whittaker brought up, we're not looking to set a fee structure that makes it practically unworkable, for the operators to be here in town. We know there's a demand, otherwise, the operators wouldn't be here, and there wouldn't be the interest, of several more to come in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate all the comments and works. I've been delving into this for the last 3-4 weeks, and it's kind of, sometimes I wonder how we're managing this. I felt like that the operators came into our city and put all these devices in here, and then now we have to manage it. So what I'm concerned about is staff's time to manage this program and the amount of money it takes for us to for your personnel to do this program and put everything together for us. So as I've thought about it, I felt, as you explained the options, to me, option 2 seemed a little more reasonable for me personally, because if you allow two or 3 vendors in the city, you don't have the inundation of the devices, the scooters and bikes in our city, and especially in a certain area. And we can do that RFP for a year or 2 and see how it rolls out, and if we want to open up to more operators, we can. But I think, as Mr. Thompson pointed out, the operators will kind of push who's going to stay in business for the long term and the short term. So I like the option 2. The other things that brought to my attention was the indemnification and the liability to us as cities. And I know that Tempe's been working on that quite a bit, but and our staff as well. But we need to have a strong indemnification process. The other thing is I like the continuity in the ordinance or whatever we propose with neighboring cities. So as ridership moves from city to city, they don't feel like, well, now it changes in Mesa or Gilbert or Tempe. So if we have some continuity there, I think it would benefit the operator as well as the user of the shared system. I like, if we go to an RFP process, perhaps the operators will throw in some benefits like geofencing or geospeeding in certain areas of the community. And I think that's an important thing, because when that scooter gets on a sidewalk and it can go literally 20 miles an hour, but then it throttles down to 3 miles per hour, I think that's safe for the user, the operator, and the person on the sidewalk. I still have, is this too detailed, Chris, Mr. Brady?
I think we've all got the ordinance written, if you'll just keep going a little. No.
Okay, I got a few more then. I'm concerned about the subleasing component. Even in the RFP process, I don't know that I would want to sublease, from the operator. If I started my own franchise, or Mr. Whittaker, we have competing businesses, then we have to have employees. It just gets complicated to me. One thing I brought up in some of our prior meetings is the ridership. Some of these young kids that are underaged riding, their parent or other guardian or whoever has authorized them to ride that bike by their license and their credit card. So if a 14-year-old is involved in a scooter accident, I was calling a motor vehicle accident, MVA, but SVA maybe is probably the better one now. Where does that go there for, we have a child injured on a scooter or a bike. The bike is probably not as big a concern as the scooter. However, that's a concern to me. So I think that needs to be vetted out a little bit more. Do we have a 3-strike, you're out, you can't operate anymore for that operator in the RFP process? And then the return on investment, I like a neutral type investment, so technology and everything evolves. But it's going to cost us money to manage this program. So we need to get back a value for our employees that are going to run this program. So that's where I'm kind of at, is I think we need to be firm on the licensing and permitting fee, whatever firm means, you'll come back with that. And then as well as a per day or use. And then the impound fee, the relocation fee, if staff does that, do we, picking up bikes for $50 a day versus $100 a day or per unit. So I would probably be a little more robust in that cost. So, but thank you. That's my thoughts. I'm kind of leaning to more option 2.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
And this may be something for Scott Butler. Has anyone approached the League of Cities and Towns to see if there can be an ordinance that's developed statewide for all the communities, so that it's a level playing field, not only for the industry, but that it's a fair process for all the cities as well?
Good morning, Mayor and Council. Councilmember Thompson, we have not started working on a model ordinance, if that's your question. However, we do anticipate that Senator Tyler Pace will be introducing a electric scooter bill in the next day or 2. Cities and towns, including Mesa, has been working with the stakeholders, particularly the industry, in drafting the language. The intent that the industry has reiterated to us is that they do not intend to include any preemptive language, so that each city and town can model their ordinance as their community desires that best fits their city or town. Again, we've been working on the language, and so far, what we've seen, we anticipate, and our goal is to find consensus language with the industry on this issue.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for staff, and then I'm anxious to hear from the public, and then I do have some thoughts on top of that. But to the point of the fee schedule, the proposed fee schedule looks, and I agree with the sentiment that we don't want to stifle innovative transportation technology by over monetizing it from a government point of view. But it does look like Phoenix, I think, and it also looks like the industry is coming in and volunteering to be regulated and to pay fees. And the suggestion, I think we proposed a $2 per device monthly fee, and the industry has suggested, well, we kind of like the Phoenix model of 10 cents a ride. It seems like that's a more lucrative suggestion than, well, I guess it all depends obviously on how many times the scooter's used, but and then also the proposal for $100 annually per company also seems particularly generous given all of the other communities regulating them, the fees are much higher. So I think we're coming in low perhaps on the fee schedule. So I would just suggest that staff look at that again, and not to be punitive or try to milk the industry, but on the other hand, it looks like we're so dramatically we're charging such a dramatically smaller amount that maybe we ought to, particularly when the industry's coming and volunteering to pay more than that, we ought to readdress that. Other question I have, all of the questions I have related to this are more about where in terms of geolocation, but also in terms of right-of-way versus sidewalk. Can you comment on, I know there are some parts of town, Main Street, for example, where we have this irony of staging vehicles on the corner, but then, next to a sign that says thou shalt not use vehicles on the sidewalk. So obviously, to me, that kind of provokes the observation that we do need to regulate this. But what are the recommendations from staff in terms of sidewalks versus right-of-way? It seems like obviously, I'm not comfortable with 14-year-old kids being on the right-of-way, going 20 miles an hour on scooters. On the other hand, I've had the same experience as Mr. Luna of walking down Main Street and fearing for my personal safety as a pedestrian because people are zipping around on scooters. So any thoughts?
Sure. Yes, Mayor. Thank you. First, in terms of the fee schedule, the fees are evolving as we're watching what's going on around the country. This was sort of our initial stab at that. So we'll certainly consider the comments, that we've received on that. The initial thought, I'll just touch briefly on the fixed fee per month, was more that we were hoping that would control an oversaturation of vehicles in our city. In other words, that if there's a vehicle that's not being used, and if you go with the per trip model, then we're not receiving any revenue from that. In our conversations with the industry, and to be fair, not one of the businesses we've talked to have expressed any objection to fees. Obviously, it's the amount, of the fee. What they've said, and you've got a couple of speakers that perhaps will address this, is that given the fluidity sort of the market in between cities, they've proposed per trip. So we'll spend more time on that. In terms of sidewalk versus right-of-way, we've had a lot of conversation on that, and you describe it well. I go back and forth. But when you brought up minors, in reality, we know that underage people are using these vehicles. If you're somewhere where there's a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit, would you prefer that child be in the bike lane if there is one, or would you want them on the sidewalk? In that sense, I'd like to see them on the sidewalks, but then there are conflicts that come with that, as you point out. Just from our reading from around the country, there have been a number of pedestrian scooter, accidents. Can't necessarily say who was at fault, but that does, create the potential for conflict. When you have a scooter that can move it up to 15 miles an hour, and you've got someone walking down the sidewalk that's moving, 2 miles an hour or whatever, their walking pace is. So I think that's one we need to explore further. And I think we should probably get some more feedback from the industry on that issue as well. And as you mentioned, downtown, that's a challenge for us, because you're correct. These bikes and scooters are being staged on the sidewalk, and then we're saying don't use them on the sidewalk. But we know in practice, at least with the scooters, that in fact many of the users are in fact, operating within the sidewalk. So that's a challenge.
All right, well, if you don't mind, let's start hearing from the public, and then we can come back and make some additional comments. Does that sound okay? I have a couple of cards. The first is, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. The first is Donovan Higbee. Welcome, Mr. Higbee. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mayor Giles, members of the City Council. My name is Donovan Higbee, and I work on the government relations team at Razor USA. Razor is here to support the staff recommended options that were presented to you today that would allow for the development of a shared active transportation vehicle program in Mesa. Our company has been in correspondence with the Transportation Department in recent months to discuss the opportunities and challenges of bringing our dockless shared scooter service to Mesa. We know that this new form of alternative mobility has posed various issues and concerns for you and the constituents you represent, which is why we support regulations that enhance rider and pedestrian safety, address issues of indemnification and liability, and require operators to be forthcoming with ridership data. Razor's core operational philosophy has been to ask permission, not forgiveness, and we are proud to have launched our service in each market only after going through the proper permitting or regulatory processes with relevant city authorities. That is why Razor has not operated in Mesa thus far, and we will continue to refrain from doing so until local regulations and ordinances indicate otherwise. We commend your staff for their thoughtfulness in developing the options you've heard today, and for keeping potential operators like Razor updated thoroughly on the regulatory development process here. Please let me or my colleagues on the Razor team know if there's anything else we can do to support your efforts moving forward. And again, thank you very much for your time, and we support moving forward on the development of a program here. So thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Higbee, and we look forward to continuing to work with staff on this. Thank you. Mr. Freeman has a question for you.
Donovan, so your branding on your scooters, is it going to say Razor or another name?
They say Razor, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Mr. Higbee? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Joshua Miller.
Council members, my name is Joshua Miller, and I'm the general manager for Lime in Arizona. I'm thrilled to be working with city staff to put in place reasonable regulations for shared active transit vehicles in Mesa. I've been generally impressed with staff's presentation and applaud the team for having a proactive and reasoned approach to regulating shared active transit vehicles. We have appreciated the transparency and open communication through the process. RJ and his team have been great. While we're generally supportive of the recommendations, we would like to share one concern about the fee structure. We do understand that that the city does incur operational expenses, and we do strongly support a cost recovery model, but we are proposing in per trip fee, much like Mayor Giles mentioned, with a structure that focuses on utilization rather than total number of vehicles on the streets. And we believe that in other cities, we have examples of this increased ridership translating to an increased fee that's paid to the city. I might add that the industry nationwide is quickly moving towards a utilization structure, much like Phoenix, which has recently proposed a 10-cent per ride structure for their proposed pilot that we look forward to coming soon. And then we feel that utilization model is a fair and equitable structure that allows the city to recover its cost without stifling businesses. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and consideration. We look forward to the process moving forward.
Another question, Mr. Miller.
Sure.
I'm going to ask, are you okay with the monthly SATV cost per vehicle?
So we actually prefer a utilization model, which is replacing the monthly fee and putting in place a per trip fee. And there's many reasons why we support that, primarily around the way that we track our data and others.
Have you shared that with Mr.
I
Zeta?
have, yes.
Okay.
We had a call with him yesterday.
Letter, did the council get the letter? Did you all send it out to council? When I saw yesterday, RJ? That explains this.
That was a letter that was actually sent to Tempe, to the mayor and
Oh,
council in
okay.
Tempe.
I
that
apologize.
We were provided a copy of.
Okay,
but-
we'll forward you would that be okay if we forwarded that
Sure.
letter to the council here?
Yeah, of course.
Because it explains that position on the
It
utilization.
does. And I
Okay.
also provided a letter last time.
Okay.
in a
Anyway, that may
prior
be helpful,
meeting.
just give some background, so we can do that.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And a question on the per ride, maybe RJ or the rep. What's it's dependent upon you reporting back those rides, right? So what's the structure there as far as monitoring per ride and how much the city gets back, or is that?
Under either scenario, whether it's a fixed fee per vehicle located in the city or it's per trip, there is going to be some self-reporting, that we're going to rely on from the business. We'll have to dig in a little deeper in that to how we verify, that the numbers that we're receiving are correct, but we are going to rely on the operators to share that information with us on a monthly basis.
And Lime does have what we call a mobility data sharing platform, which is an API that we provide to the city should they be interested, that communicates and delivers all trip numbers and relevant data.
Is that through like a daily, weekly,
real
monthly?
time.
Real time?
In
Okay.
real time. So whatever we think is best for the city, we're happy to comply with.
Jen?
Regarding the ridership, do we have current data as far as where the density of the rides are? I know along transit, of course, but in other parts of the city, I'm curious if there is demand in like the eastern parts.
Councilmember Duff, we have not yet sought geographic information, specific to locations. We have the number of scooters, and we'll follow the bikes as well. This is going back to when it was just Bird and Lime. They have provided us information on the numbers, the average trip lengths, that sort of thing. We haven't gone further into more specific information that they could share. All of the operators that we've talked to have the ability to provide that sort of information. Some of the feedback that we've gotten is that whether it's more of an open approach or a regulated approach, they want to ensure that there's a level playing field, so that what we're asking of one operator, it applies to all of the operators. So that's something we'll have to spend a little bit more time on.
Well, I realize there is a high ridership in the central area here in Mesa, in connecting the points, the bus and the rail. So I am in support of having the scooters with some controls. I do like the monthly fee versus the trip fee. In fact, a trip fee at $2 monthly would only be like 20 trips. So it would be even more lucrative to be limited to $2 per vehicle. But I'm worried about the density of how many scooters are in a place that create the obstacles that we have in our right-of-ways. So my intuition is to support option 2 and have some controls, especially around transit, to be able to include those areas and study those areas and look at, for many of the things that we've already mentioned in controlling the number of operators, who's responsible, who to contact if there are problems being the wrong way, the staff impact and what those costs are and how that's, the controls of how many, and look at where the needs are. I know we have it in District 4, maybe within a 2-mile radius of the light rail. We'll continue to study that, but I know there may be other areas, maybe around ASU Polytech or other places, that we might want to consider some pocket areas of control, and to learn and then expand from there. And of course, we'll watch state regulation as well as other cities and see what the impacts are to our community, especially with underage population riding the scooters. I have concerns first of all, they shouldn't be on the scooter since it should be 18 years old, and know the traffic laws and safety laws about being on the streets. So some of the things to consider. I know we have other means of just bicycles and other things that are already in existence that can provide, but this is where vendors are coming in and placing these readily available at a moment's notice and populate our streets. So we have to take some concern and regulation in that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a few thoughts that I'd like to share, and then, of course, hear from other folks. But again, my concerns on this topic are more around the location, where. And we talked earlier about the right-of-way versus sidewalk where, and I think that's a conversation we're going to continue to have, and I'm anxious to get when this comes back with some proposals. I think we are going to need to address that, and I don't know what the answer is. I know there are clearly some sidewalks where it's inappropriate in very urban areas, but I'm looking forward to resolving that issue in the future as we continue to discuss this. I see these as something that are here to stay. I think they're part of the evolving transportation technology and that we're wrestling with and becoming a transit-oriented community. So I certainly don't favor the complete prohibition proposal. But to me, I think this is more of an urban rather than a suburban phenomenon. I do see these occasionally planted on the sidewalks in my neighborhood, and they seem, frankly, extremely out of place in that context. It seems like they're more being utilized by juveniles for goofing off and being tossed in the canal than they are for some sort of productive reason. So I do like the geolocating suggestion, where we link this to transit, we link it to an urban scenario where we want to something that's complementary to an urban lifestyle for people to get from point A to point B, but not something that just clutters sidewalks and interferes with folks with disabilities. So that leads me to the conclusion that option 2 that's been proposed is my favored option. I also do think this is entirely appropriate for us to enter into a licensing situation, because there are serious safety concerns related to this. I think we all know people who work on the city staff whose family have been seriously injured in these types of scenarios. So I think we do need to do what we can to address the safety concerns with regard to the speed of the vehicle, the age of those that can use it, helmets. Liability is also a serious concern. I guarantee you we will be sued, as every other city who does this is going to be sued. And if we have an indemnity agreement that says that we're not protected in the event of our own negligence, I guarantee you'll have a crack in the sidewalk, and someone will say, well, you knew that you licensed these, and then you had sidewalks with cracks in them. And so Mesa, you're liable. So I think another one of the issues that needs to be resolved going forward is the extent of the indemnification that we get. And we absolutely will be writing big checks if we don't have appropriate indemnification going forward on these. So for all those reasons, I support going forward with an option 2 scenario. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. A lot of these, and frankly, I would also suggest we do this on a short term, maybe like a year or at a time, because this is evolving so quickly. I think the folks in Tempe, for example, the last time I drove downtown Tempe, these scooters were everywhere. And I think Tempe's attitude is it's just limiting the number or figuring out how to regulate how many, the demand there. I don't know that we'll ever be in the short term like that, but I think we ought to look at it in short increments so that as these issues evolve and we identify problems, we can address them. So those are my thoughts. I'm going to join the option 2 category. Now let's go with Mr. Heredia.
So could we set some of the requirements on option 2 on the permitting and license piece? I'm having a problem with the option 2 on the RFP, limiting to just a couple companies. Wondering if there's a blend of option 2 and 1 that you can that you can do as far as when you set up these items as far as requirements around geofencing and others around transit? Do you set it up under the permit licensing piece? And then I just have a question. You know, I think market will bear out on what scooters would be best to use. You know, the individual will choose. So I'm having a little difficult time on the RFP process, but I agree on the option 2, the items there as far as looking at all the items on geofencing and staging location and all those things, but just the RFP kind of.
Mayor, Councilmember Heredia, if we go back to a slide that we had up earlier in the presentation, so we're proposing sort of a base level of regulation, regardless if it's sort of a market-based approach or an RFP-based approach. So we would bring back to council a proposed ordinance or licensing requirements that would deal with the indemnification issue, would deal with maximum speed limits. The user requirement, sidewalks, versus, streets is one we still have to spend some more time on. I've taken the feedback that you'd like us to revisit the fee structure. So sort of those basic requirements would exist regardless of which approach we go following that. Some of the feedback we've actually received from industry is that the ability to require geofencing, or the new term we've learned, geospeeding, and that sort of thing, feedback that we received is that the more operators there are in the space, that at least we've gotten some feedback that they're less willing to get further into the more restrictive requirements. And that is one possible benefit of an RFP-based approach, is that we could start to get, more specific. For example, if we decided that Pioneer Park, in downtown, Mesa was not a good place, for scooters or bikes to operate, that's where geofencing or geospeeding, could come into play. So we're not set on the number of operators, but obviously the gentleman from Razor spoke, so that's the potential for a 6th operator, in town, and we appreciate that they've come to us, frankly, before they've launched. We need to work through these issues.
So so the RFP process, that's the only way to get those kinds of things, or can we set within the permitting and licensing piece that they include those items? So it kind of, during that process, folks that don't have those options, they won't be operating in Mesa.
We'd have to work through the details, but I do believe we could, whatever council wishes to, impose in terms of the requirements, I think we could include that within the licensing structure.
I just want to say I agree with Frankie, and my concern about an RFP model is it completely starts to lock out small businesses, right? So when you have a model that requires an RFP, now you have companies that are required to have people that can write proposals and all these other things. And in my opinion, that stifles competition and ultimately leads to higher prices. But the small business owners should be able to compete as well. And I'm not saying that we don't geofence or geospeed these devices and create reasonable regulations. But to go to an RFP process simply allows the bigger companies to succeed while locking out the small businesses. And that would be my biggest concern with an RFP model.
Okay, well, again, we'll resolve some of these issues when it comes back, but Mr. Thompson's been waiting to say something. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, I agree with my colleagues as well. If we're going to go towards an option 2, I have concerns about an RFP. And somebody that lives in the RFP and procurement world, it costs a lot of money for vendors to prepare an RFP and submit an RFP just to be turned down. And besides, as quickly as technology is changing, I mean, it's really changing on a day-to-day basis. Do we really want to lock into a long-term 2 or 3 year contract with a vendor? Because you certainly don't want to have to go out and have them go to RFP annually, because that's a lot of money they're spending and a lot of time and energy and effort on staff as well as their staff. And so I have concerns about going to an RFP. And to Councilmember Whittaker's point, I think it stifles competition. And, you never know who tomorrow is the next best scooter provider that's even safer for our citizens. And they would literally be blocked out of the arena until the RFP expired. And that's really, to me, that's really not fair to them. So if we're going to, your baseline ordinances, I think, are a good thing, as long as we're not over-regulating them. But, I really have concerns with going to an RFP because, that long-term RFP really blocks people out. And with technology, I struggle with that.
So Mayor and Council, I think the tension, and so there's a couple of questions in there. So if without an RFP, then all the regulations will be embedded in the permit. So if someone wants to come and do business in the city, essentially RFP is establishing not probably in the typical way we think of an RFP where they're coming up with their own ideas. It's really the concept of you're responding to this RFP. Maybe that's the wrong approach, but the idea is you're going to comply with all the rules the council's going to adopt. You're going to abide by the indemnification. You're going to, whether we're allowing subleasing, you're going to agree about the placement and location. We can work on that, whether it's an RFP. I think that what that leads to, though, in the RFP was the thought that from a management perspective, it's easier to manage 3 or 4 than it is 7 or 8. Now, if council says, well, that's okay, we want more competition, that's fine. I think the question then becomes, because I heard a little bit of this, but I want to be clear, because part of the RFP process too is to say if we're going to have a defined area to start off with, and let's say, we're really geofencing an area just to kind of prove the concept, make sure it works and it's manageable. The thought was we were also going to limit the number of scooters within that area. Now, if we didn't do that, then obviously people can come and dump as many scooters inside the area as they want. Obviously, they have to do it in the right locations. But there was concern, maybe not so much today if you were to walk out down on Main Street, but certainly 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, the proliferation was becoming a significant challenge. There weren't enough corners in downtown Mesa for all the scooters. So those are just thoughts we had, so I just put that out there.
Well, and I think, when I met with industry earlier this week, one of the things that they brought up is that there's a cost to them to operate and maintain these scooters. And so they're not going to leave scooters sitting out there that aren't producing because that's a burden on them. That's a cost that, they're not getting a return on investment on. So, they track all that information and they try to get them off the street and redeploy them in areas that they're going to be used. And, they're not going to put 500 out if only 100 of them are being used. They're going to reposition those and reprogram those for other cities or other locations. So I think, the market will dictate how many should be on each corner and so forth.
Right. No, and that's a very good point. But it kind of goes back to the discussion with industry about do you do utilization rates or do you do the number of scooters gets charged? Because the number of it's the idea you get to place your scooter on our right-of-way. If it doesn't get utilized, it's great advertising on our corners for no cost. And so we need to work through this. I get the point from the industry, well, you should only pay for those that are getting used. But in the meantime, they're also at no cost to them putting scooters on our right-of-way. So effectively becoming, if they're not being used, they're free advertising. So we just need to work through, and you could probably argue both sides of that, but that's where we're in the discussion.
I just want to point out that I think I don't know if somebody from the industry is here, but my understanding is these scooters cost like $1,200, right? I can't imagine that from a marketing perspective. It makes sense to just leave these things sitting around on corners.
Well, that's what we're seeing today.
Out on the corners.
What we're seeing today is a proliferation of these because the demand of the individuals that want to ride, and that's how the whole business process works. They use GPS to see which scooters are being utilized the heaviest, and then they go and they saturate that area with more scooters. That's the whole reason why the business is able to succeed, and we should keep that in mind, that the proliferation of these devices is because the demand is there from our citizens that want to ride these devices, and I'm sure they could provide the statistics on how many of these are just sitting idle and aren't being used on a daily basis. But we should also keep in mind that by switching to an RFP model and limiting, let's say, 3 vendors, by the basic law of supply and demand, the companies are then going to block out these markets and can charge more money to the people that are riding these scooters because they've locked in the market share. There's only 3 competing companies now versus a market. The whole reason that allows this business model to succeed is that you have competition, right? If one company charges too much, like Lime Bikes, another company can come in and compete with them and lower the price, which ultimately lowers the cost of transportation to the people that live in our city. So again, from my perspective, to lock 3 companies into an RFP is, we'll be forced to see a rise and increase the cost for these scooters as people try to use them. So I don't know how the RFP model makes sense.
Okay.
On the license, could you set a cap of numbers as far as?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, per the mayor's comments, I do agree to look at, it seems like a big on the permanent license fee. The other cities is a big, gap there.
Sure.
As far as Mesa and other cities. And if we look at, the options here, I would say to look at that fee on the permit, if we allow everybody to maybe raise that. I'm still, like, the per monthly, that, for me, that's the best option. Per ride, it is still it's self-reporting, so I have some issues around that. But if industry in the city can work on the per ride piece and see how do we structure that to have a greater, the monitor piece there, that's my concern on the per ride piece. Fixed costs on the monthly piece per SATV is where I would lean to, but if we are able to take care in some of these items within the permit and license fees, the cap of number of scooters and even the playing field, some folks might put less, or some folks put up to the max and see where that leads into, but figuring that out, I think that's where I'm kind of coming at.
Thank you. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to thank the operators for pressing this conversation with us. I know Bird's in the room, so they've been quiet, so I appreciate them being here. One thing I thought, Mr. Brady, is about, regardless of what process we talk about, perhaps public safety announcements can be used on how to educate the ridership through the operators. There might be helmets, building, like scooter racks or bike racks combined in certain locations, whether an RFP process is used or some other thing, instead of us bearing the cost of, if the scooters are self-standing and the bikes are self-standing, then that's not an issue. But regardless, the racking system and locations of them. But if we could utilize what we can to make our ridership safe by utilizing the operators' expertise, I'd like that to look into as well. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Smith.
Mayor and council, if I can share with you, and I think Chris started off with this, in fact, that the options were sort of different bookends of the spectrum, and then one that's sort of right in the middle. And as we've looked at some other cities, there's a spectrum between that. And so as you struggle within that spectrum, let me suggest that there's other ways in which you can sort of get there too. We've seen a few examples, and we can create more. One of the problems is saturation, and how we've seen that being addressed is through separation requirements. Another one is as far as what I'll call dumping, as far as trying to, there's at least articles that talk about that these get moved from, especially during the winter, from our colder climates to here in Arizona. And so you see sort of a lot of these within the winter. We could also look at tiering as far as the fees and also the numbers. So one city does tier what is the allowable numbers. We could also look at tiers as far as fees. In other words, you can have a per trip fee for a certain number of scooters, but after that point, to prevent saturation or dumping, the fee does go to a per vehicle fee. So there's other options. In other words, so you have to, once you start to look at the complexity of it, there's other ways to sort of address the problem. And so we're looking at it with sort of three 3 points, as opposed to the reality is there's a spectrum of trying to address the issue. And so I think there's a lot of good feedback, but I just want to point out, and it was Councilmember Heredia said, isn't there something in between this? And the answer is yes. There are other points within this spectrum, and so maybe we can also look at other solutions to get you where you want without sort of locking in on exactly one of these options.
Thank you. Other comments? Well, this is agendized to provide direction, and I think you've got a lot of direction there. So what I heard is a preference for the option 2 with a geo-fencing. It seemed there were consensus on that, but I think when you come back with your next recommendations, we'll continue to have a robust discussion around licensure versus RFPs and the term of the agreements, whether there's what the fee structure will be, where we're going to do this, where the right-of-ways are, and then the density issue. Are we going to try to regulate the number, fearing for congestion? So,
Mayor, I just quickly, I
Yes.
want to clarify. I think I hear, though, from council members, as opposed to doing an RFP, we could just essentially establish these rules and regulations within the permit and license as someone comes in the door. So they're not being required to respond to an RFP. They're just, when they come in the door, the rules and regulations would be established as part of the permit process or the license process. And then that begins to lay out that everybody has to play by the same rules. The rules are established and they're sitting there. The fees are all established for everyone. I think at some point, then we come back, the question to council is, and we'll come back with some proposed, areas, that defined areas where this would be allowed, is maybe we're not necessarily controlling the number of vendors, but, and Councilman Whittaker brought up some good points. Is there interest in putting caps on the total number of scooters, or do we just allow to have whatever happens within that area take place, and then there's winners and losers are driven by other means? Again, sometimes that process, it works great in the private world, but sometimes the public response to that is having to go through that, difficulty of having scooters everywhere. So we'll have that conversation when we come back.
Yeah, personally, I'm not sure where I come out on that question. I think that right now we have chaos. And maybe just by having licensing in and of itself and charging a fee, that will
Yeah, because we're not charging a fee
take
now,
care of
so maybe
itself.
that begins
Yeah.
to weigh in on that, so.
All right. Okay, thank you. More to be said on this from anyone? Thank you very much. We look forward to what you'll bring back.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda, item 2, is to acknowledge receipt of minutes of boards and committees. Is there a motion to that effect? Thank you, Mr. Freeman, Mr. Luna. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Next is item 3, to hear reports on meetings and conferences attended. Council members, anything you'd like to share with us? Mr. Freeman.
Mayor, this might be just a little bit off, but last night we had a third alarm fire in the city of Mesa. We had a severe damage to one of our Mesa businesses, Mesa Sales. And I asked maybe our Mesa Fire Chief, Assistant Chief James Johnson, he sent out the notification, if he could just brief council on the fire. I know there was a heavy fire load in the business. I've been in there many times, and I hate to see it burned up. It's a great asset to our community, long-standing business. Chief.
Mayor and Vice Mayor Freeman, thank you. Again, James Johnson, Mesa Fire Department, Assistant Chief over Fire Operations. The number one thing I first want to say is we're very thankful that there were no injuries last night, despite the numerous challenges that we had with the fire. So we're happy to report that. About 5:45 last night, the call came in. There was heavy smoke and fire, unfortunately, from Mesa Sales. Crews initially upgraded very quickly to a first alarm and second alarm due to the challenges that we had with, as you said, fire load. And we also had the exposures to the businesses of our RV trailers and things that we needed to protect. It was a very tough fire, but we did a good job of containing it to there, and we're happy to say that it did contain there. And again, no injuries. And we also worked with Mesa PD was key to helping us contain the citizens and the traffic around the scene. They also helped us with exposures. We had exposure of the smoke and stuff to the apartments that were adjacent to there that we were able to contain those folks in their locations. So we're happy to report that. And again, our automatic aid system, we had numerous from Gilbert, Tempe, Scottsdale, whether they were at the fire helping us or taking care of business at our stations. So we were appreciative of all their help to continue with our normal emergency services that we had. So it's a brief rundown. It's an unfortunate event. Very sorry that it happened, but as best we could take care of it, we feel it was a success. So.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you. Yeah, we're proud of the great job our fire department does, so thank you for
Thank you.
keeping us safe.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Thompson.
Mayor, one of the things I wanted to talk about, got a little bit of update yesterday at a Superstition precinct. They did their homeless outreach operation, and Commander Cutler gave me some updates. They, looks like they contacted around 47 individuals that were homeless, and out of that, they were able to get at least 20 of those people help. Yep, 49 people were contacted, 59 food boxes were given out, 43 pamphlets were provided, and overall 20 people were sent with a navigator to get help. So that was, to me, that was a great success for Commander Butler Commander Cutler and his men and women in their out of Superstition. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Luna.
Yeah, actually, as a follow-up to that, we want to thank Mark Azerby from New Hope, who is the director of the church there, and Community Bridges and the Navigators for volunteering. We had a really good turnout. There was a lot of people there, so they did a really good job. So certainly I want to reiterate what my friend Kevin here is talking about. The other thing is that I attended a U Connect Mesa hosted by Cynthia Scura from Neighborhood Outreach. There was a strategic planning meeting with a number of HOAs in the community. Very successful, had a good turnout, and so that was great. So I want to thank Neighborhood Services for that. And the Mesa Police Academy number 11, which started in January of 1999, they received their gold badge signifying 20 years of service. Certainly that's significant for our police officers, so we want to congratulate them. It's a significant milestone for them. So a lot of great things happening in the city.
Absolutely. Anything else you'd like to share with us, Council? Ms. Duff.
I'd like to share, there was numerous meetings this week on, what do we call, Transform 17 or Site 17, the Washington Escobedo area of 25-plus acres at Mesa Drive and University. And I wanted to thank all the citizens and organizations that participated in this second phase of looking at how to develop and what density is needed and what the ideas were and creating a synergy with our downtown and surrounding areas and neighborhoods. So there will be a feasibility study on the input, and there'll be some more information forthcoming in March before we go forward. And so I wanted to say thank you to everybody. Also, yesterday I attended a food truck fundraiser right near Mesa Public Schools across the street in benefit of Mesa United Way. We had a great turnout. Thank you again to everybody who showed up. Instead of big galas, maybe we should just have food truck Wednesdays, I don't know. No, but it was fun, and thank you to everybody who turned out. And I think it should be a repeat performance.
Thank you. Anything else? If not, Mr. Brady, update us on our next meeting schedule, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to remind everyone, we will not be having a council meeting Monday the 4th, but we will have, the mayor has a State of the City address, which will be Tuesday, February 5th from 7 to 9 a.m. at the Mesa Convention Center. You can also watch it live on Mesa Channel 11. Our next council study session will be Thursday, February 7th at 7:30, and our next city council meeting will be Monday, February 11th. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Is there, if there's nothing else, is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So.
Thank you very much. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.